Okay. All of that information is available to you. All of that information is at your disposal. It's for the purpose of being able to be used on the midterm. If you have questions for me, I will be available to answer your questions until the end of day tomorrow, right? So you have all day today, you have all day tomorrow. After tomorrow, you're on your own as it pertains to your midterm. Other questions, of course, I'll be happy to answer. But just keep in mind, after tomorrow, end of day, you no longer have access to me as a resource. So if you do have these questions, utilize this time, utilize whatever time is after we get done today, shoot me an email, utilize whatever time you have tomorrow, shoot me an email. But again, give yourself time to do the work. My suggestion, one question a day. That way you're not overwhelmed. You will not, I repeat, you will not be able to sit down on Monday and just bang out this test. That's not how it's designed. You will not do well. I guarantee you, the only people who do not do well on this test are the people who try to do it at the last minute. It's not, it sounds harder than it is. If you've done your reading, you'll be okay. But if you do not give yourself time, you will not do well on the test. So I beg you, 3 days, choose 3 days within the 6 days that you have to do it. One question a day, you'll be good. And that gives you an extra 3 days to revise, to read, to make sure it sounds the way that you want it to. Is there any questions about anything you heard so far? Okay, so I don't know how many of y'all had a chance to look at the study guide yet, but the study guide is designed. If you could answer those questions, you'll be prepared to answer the questions on the midterm. Now, it's not the exact same questions. They won't be worded the same, but the themes and the major emphasis of the points will be the same. What we'll do today is kind of work through these bullet points on the study guide, um, collectively come up with the answers to these points, and then that should help you all be prepared for the midterm. All right, let me pull up my study guide. Give me one moment here. And then again, don't hesitate to stop me or tell me to slow down or tell me to repeat something if you need me to. Um, so again, based on how this looks, it may sound difficult, right? But it's not. It's very much pulled from our previous discussions throughout the week. It's very much pulled from the readings that we've done throughout the week. So if you can navigate through the readings, you would have no problem answering these questions, right? So looking at chapter 1 for our week 2 reading, looking at the book, Research Methods in Africana Studies, the question starts off, define research, define scientific research. Discuss the distinctions between these two. So one, I'm asking you to define research, define scientific research. But then clearly there's a difference between regular research and scientific research. Be able to discuss that difference, right? In the text, he says, scientific research has to be distinguished from casual everyday research. It's on page 2. Scientific research refers to a systematic investigation. It involves the discovery, explanation, and description of a subject or topic. So again, what distinguishes the two? It's a systematic investigation. There's a system set in place that separates scientific research from regular research, right? So when I'm asking you to discuss the distinctions, that discussion should involve this scientific, systematic approach to investigation, right? That's what I'm looking for you to be able to articulate that what separates scientific research from normal research is the systematic investigation, okay? We know that on page 2, you have your definition for research and scientific research. So a lot of the answers that you should find for this first question here should be found on page 2, okay? Another thing that I want to point out. So if we're looking at topic 1 here, you notice that you have the initial question on the first line, you have a bullet point question 2, you have a bullet point question 3 and 4, bullet point 5, question 5, and 6. So within this one section, there's about 7 questions. Does that make sense? So define research and scientific research, discuss the distinction between the two. So that's 1. Discuss the role of Africana studies in the distinction between research and scientific research. That's 2. What is the domain of inquiry? 3. What is the domain of inquiry for Africana studies? 4. What are the ways of knowing? 5. What are the ways of knowing for Africana studies and how do they counter Western or Eurocentric ways of knowing? 6. So this one section, right? And if we're going to think of this as a question, right? This would be a 6-point question. So you want to make sure that you're answering and addressing every component of the question. And this is why I say you don't want to just sit down the day of the test and try to answer the questions. The questions are too convoluted for you to kind of just sit down and bang that out, right? So, for example, if you tell me what research is, if you tell me what scientific research is, you discuss the distinction of the two, right? You tell me what the domain of inquiry is, and you tell me what the domain of inquiry is for Africana studies. If you tell me what the ways of knowing are and how ways of knowing are separate from Eurocentric or Western ways of knowing, that would give you 5 points out of the 6 points. Because what you did not do is discuss the role Africana studies plays in the distinction. Does that make sense? Y'all with me? So this is what I'm saying. Like you want to make sure you have time to go through the entirety of the question and you address each question because the questions on the midterm will sound very much like this, right? There'll be like 6 or 7 questions included into one question. This is why I'm saying take your time. Okay. So we know that the difference between scientific research and regular research is the systematics investigation, right? So we're thinking about Africana studies, and I'm going to leave this open for you all to discuss, right? How does Africana studies lead to this difference between research and scientific research? If it's a systematic investigation is the difference, where does Africana studies play in providing the systematic approach to research? Now, if you're looking in the text, you may be able to find an answer on page 3 towards the bottom. So it says on page 3, the study of research methods prepares people to produce practical research that will benefit the African world and sustain the utilitarian relevance of Africana studies in the everyday lives of the people of African descent, right? So we know that what separates regular research from scientific research is the systematic approach, right? But what the author is arguing is that for Africana studies research, it should be able to be relevant to the everyday lives of African people, right? And so if it's relevant, if it should be relevant to the everyday lives of African people, then the systematic aspect of it, it must be applied in a way that would allow it to be relevant to people's everyday lives. That's the systematic approach that Africana studies provides to research, right? So this is how the discipline informs the distinction. So we know the distinction is the systematic investigation, but what that systematic investigation should lead to is to investigations or research that is relevant to Black folks' everyday lives. Does that make sense? All right. So the next bullet point is the what is the domain of inquiry? And then what is the domain of inquiry for Africana studies in particular? So on page 4, you were provided with the domain of inquiry. The domain of inquiry refers to the specific aspects, subsets, or dimensions of reality on which a discipline focuses its thought, right? So that's a very clear definition that we're looking for bullet point 2 on question 1, right? What is the domain of inquiry? The domain of inquiry refers to the specific aspects, subsets, or dimensions of reality on which a discipline focuses its thought, okay? And then so the question now becomes, what is the domain of inquiry for Africana studies? So what do you all think is the domain of inquiry for Africana studies? What are we studying? What are we researching? What is the focus for this discipline?
African people.
Yep, perfect. And we can expand that, right? It could include the African world. So not only African people, but African history, African phenomenon, African culture, African language, all of these things incorporate the domain of studies, sorry, the domain of inquiry for Africana studies. Um, all right. Anyone else have a question, comment, or concern before we move on to the next point? Am I moving too fast for y'all, or this is a good pace? All right. All right. What are the ways of knowing? What are the ways of, sorry, what are ways of knowing? What are ways of knowing for Africana studies, and how do they counter Western or Eurocentric ways of knowing? So, ways of knowing is just like how we come to know things, right? Whether that be through study, whether that be through oral history, right? Whether that be through engaging media. Ways of knowing is how we accumulate epistemology. And epistemology just means knowledge, right? So that is, I would say it's open, right? Like just think about how we learn as a society. That's going to allow you to articulate the ways of knowing. But then the secondary question, what are ways of knowing for Africana studies, and how do they counter Eurocentric or Western thought or Western ways of knowing, right? Um, so on page 5, they say that tradition is a common way of knowing, right? And we could accept that. Um, but one of the things that African people and I would say indigenous people offer as ways of knowing that may not be recognized in the Western world, right, are the folklore that's passed down from your familiar tree, right? Your family legacy that's passed down, your family traditions, right? Things like cooking recipes, right? These are things that are orally passed down from generation to generation. So for Africana studies, these ways of knowing are accepted not only in the social space, right? But they're also accepted within the classroom. And think back, I think it was to week 2 when I told you, bring your outside knowledge into the classroom, right? If there's things that your mom and your grandmother told you that is relevant to what we're discussing, bring that into the space, right? Now, that's different from normalized or Western or Eurocentric ways of knowing, because the way that they say it is it can only come from this authoritative source, right? And this authoritative source are typically old dead white men that are in these books, right? And if it's outside of these old dead white men that are in the books, then this is not a valid way of knowing. So for Africana studies, we open up the ways of knowing to include non-traditional ways of knowing. Again, conversations passed down from elders, conversations passed down from grandmother, knowledge passed down from grandmother, right? So this is how the discipline counteracts or subverts Eurocentric ways of knowing, right? We allow for things that are done outside of the classroom to be used and to be validated within the classroom. All right. Any questions on this first section, or what we could classify as question 1? Everybody's good with that? All right. So going to question 2 or section 2. This is dealing with chapter 2. One second, let me get it. So chapter 2 is methodology in Africana studies research. So we're asking you to define method, define methodology, discuss the distinction between the two. So again, just like question 1, we're having definitions and then a discussion around the distinction between these two definitions. So looking on page 33, the opening page of chapter 2, it says that the difference between the words method and methodology is more than just 3 syllables. As mentioned earlier, a research method is a tool of data collection. So we know that method is a tool of data collection, right? Methodology includes, but goes beyond a researcher's choice of a method of data collection. So methodology, it includes the method, right? But it goes beyond that too. It says Africana studies. Well, let me just stop there. So that's the distinction, right, between method and methodology. Method is a tool for data collection. Methodology goes beyond just that tool and offers other ways that the researcher goes about producing a method, right? So it goes beyond just that research data tool. So you want to be able to talk about the beyond, right? So let me provide you with a further explanation. So for my methodology for my dissertation, it was Afrofuturism, right? So the way that I thought about educating Black people was through a Afrofuturistic method, right? I would use Afrofuturistic paradigms to collect information, right? So one of the things about Afrofuturism is this idea of the possibility of the imagination, right? So if I'm going to collect information about from students, I'm going to make sure from an Afro futuristic standpoint to ask them about the imagination, right? So where is the role of the imagination in your educational pursuits, right? So this is how Afrofuturism serves as a method for me. I'm going to use that to collect information, right? But as a methodology, is allowing me to think about something in a certain way, right? So now, not only am I collecting data around the imagination, now I'm thinking about the imagination in ways that allows me to produce a pedagogy that will be comprehensive, right? So the distinction I'm trying to get you to be attentive to is the notion that methodology goes beyond just the method. It allows you to do more work, right? Produce more epistemology beyond just that tool for gathering data, right? Another way to think about this, once you got the data, right, through your method, once that data has been collected, what are you going to do with it? The methodology allows you to know what you're going to do with that data. So this is the distinction that we're trying to make between method and methodology. Everybody all right with that? Everybody on board with that? Okay.
Okay.
Um, So discuss the authors. So you have to read this very slow because it's a convoluted bullet point. Bullet point one on question two. Discuss the author's argument against Africana studies being interdisciplinary slash multidisciplinary. So on page 33 at the very bottom, he says Africana studies is sometimes referred to as multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. So we know right there, this is the argument, right? This is where he's picking up this argument. This author asserts that the discipline is unidisciplinary and has multiple dimensions. So let's unpack this a little bit more. What does it mean to be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary? What does that mean? Interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary?
I would say like with multi, it'll be like more than one for sure.
Right. And so what do you think interdisciplinary means?
Like it's just one within something.
Yes, perfect. So multidisciplinary, right? So Africana studies has history, it has sociology, it has philosophy, all tied up within it, right? Then we have interdisciplinary, to where you have an intersection of various disciplines. So we'll take sociology and philosophy and bring those two together, and we'll have kind of the same work that Africana studies does, right? The author's like, nah, fuck that. That's not what Africana studies is. No, it's unidisciplinary. It's one discipline, but it has multiple dimensions, right? So within Africana studies, you can do philosophical work. Within Africana studies, you can do sociological work. Within Africana studies, you can do historical work, but this is all under the umbrella of Africana studies as a discipline, right? And he says that we cannot conflate or confuse the two. Africana studies is not interdisciplinary. Africana studies is not multidisciplinary. It's unidisciplinary with various and multiple dimensions, right? And that's the argument that the author is trying to make against Africana studies being interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. And this is how he's trying to assert that Africana studies is unidisciplinary with multiple dimensions, right? because you can still do historical, sociological, philosophical, psychological work all within the umbrella of Africana studies. And think of it this way, right? Sociology, by and large, is not too much concerned with the occurrences of Black folks, right? Sociology is just looking at the society as a whole. So how white folks are impacted, how Asian folks are impacted, is looking at everybody, right? So if you're going to do this work from a sociological perspective, you may have some very big blind spots as it pertains to the realities of Black folks. So you can see now how sociology is inequipped to do Africana studies work because they don't completely focus on Black folks, right? But for example, W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Philadelphia Negro, is a sociological text. Sorry, it's an Africana studies text that employs sociological methods, right? So this is him using the discipline of Africana studies to engage in sociology type of work, but he's focusing on Black people, right? So again, sociology would be incomplete in its attempt to focus on and research Blackness, right? But Africana studies as a discipline can engage in sociological work and still maintain its disciplinary structure. This is why he says unidisciplinary with multiple dimensions, right? Okay.
So you just like psychological, physiological, sociology, all within just focusing on our group of people.
And that's how it stays under the umbrella of Africana studies. But you could do all of this different type of work from all these different type of dimensions. But if you were to do just purely sociological work, you're going to miss some of the aspects of race, right? Because one of the things about sociology, right? Marx is very heavy in sociology. Marx. That's a great class analysis, but it does not incorporate the race question, right? History. History will do this great historical work, but it oftentimes leaves out Africa from the history, right? So we can see how these other disciplines they're incomplete, they're insufficient when it comes to addressing our needs and our realities. But Africana studies as a discipline will address our needs, our realities, and allow us to do the historical work, the psychological work, the sociological work, etc. Um, Back to our definitions. I'm asking for you to define paradigm. You'll find a definition of paradigm on page 35. A paradigm is a general way of understanding and approaching knowledge about the world. Paradigms guide a researchers through the experiences of acquiring knowledge. A paradigm can also be described in a practical sense as a systematic arrangement of explanations and ideas that guide policy and action. So again, we have this word systematic reappear, right? So he says a paradigm can be a systematic arrangement of the explanation of ideas that guide policy and action, right? So it's a way of helping us categorize, it's a way of helping us understand complex ideas, right? But then ultimately, that understanding through the paradigm should allow us to shape action and policy, right? So it shouldn't just only operate at the level of just understanding, right? It should be able to be moved and motivated to where you're being actionable with it and you're impacting policy. So that's a paradigm. Um, so also, I'm asking of you not only to define paradigm, but be able to talk about the various paradigms within the text, right? So page 36, we have cultural deficit paradigm. Page 37, we have cultural difference paradigm, colonial paradigm. Page 39, we have Pan-African paradigm. We have Afrocentric paradigm. So just be able to choose about two of those and kind of speak to them a little bit. Whatever one sticks out to you, just be able to have some type of cursory conversation about the paradigms. It doesn't have to be too much in detail. Just kind of Pan-African paradigm is this, blah, blah, blah. Afrocentric paradigm is this, blah, blah, blah. And that's sufficient for me. And then finally, define theory, define concept. How are the two concepts interrelated? So we have to be able to unpack what a theory is. On page 52, we have theory. Theory is a part of what distinguishes one discipline from another, what gives it its unique lens of analysis. But what is theory? No doubt you have heard someone say the words, I've got a theory, followed by their explanation of how they suspect that some aspect of the world works. After all, I'm sorry, here we go. Definition. A theory seeks to explain the relationship between a set of concepts. Concepts are abstract ideals that enable one to categorize data. Concepts are the component of theories, and taken together, they explain some aspect of reality. So, theory, define theory. Theory seeks to explain the relationship between a set of concepts. So, theory is intended to explain the relationship between a set of concepts, right? And then, so we're also asking for you is to define concept. Concepts are abstract ideas that enable one to categorize data, right? So they're abstract. These concepts, excuse me, are somewhat hard to pin down, but they allow you to categorize data, right? So I could put this set of information over here because of this concept allows me to understand this set of information in a certain way, right? But the theory helps explain the concepts. So when I ask you how are the two concepts interrelated, right? You can't have theory without concept, right? Because it's the theory that helps understand the concepts. So they're dependent upon one another. Without concept, there is no theory. This is how they become interrelated, because the theory is about explaining and making sense of the concept. So we have your definition for theory, you have your definition for concept, and now you know how they are interrelated, because to have a theory is dependent upon a concept. Any questions about section 2? All right. So we'll move on to section 3, and that's ethics and research. Here we go. All right. Number 3, define ethics. Why is ethical research important for Africana studies? Sorry, for African people in Africana studies, right? Ethics on page 93, first page of chapter 3. Ethics refers to the philosophy of morality, excuse me. Ethics refers to the philosophy of morality. What counts as good or bad, right or wrong. In order to guide proper behavior, societies and organizations create ethical codes. So that's what our definition of ethics is, right? It's the philosophy of morality. What counts as good or bad, right or wrong. That's what ethics are. Now, why is ethical research important for African people and African studies? Now, think about things like the Tuskegee experiments, right? Think about all the women who were used for sexual reproductive health knowledge that were experimented on without the proper anesthesia and the proper treatment, right? These are some of the standardized research practices that cause African people to be suspicious of research practices. These are some of the research practices that cause for a demand in ethical research. So for African people, the need for ethical research is there because we have been the victims of unethical research, right? Our lived firsthand experience has told us to be suspicious of this. So with that being said, as a discipline that concerns African people, because again, the domain of inquiry for Africana studies is Africana phenomenon, Africana people, Africana experiences, right? So this discipline that is based on the people who have been victims of unethical research must produce research that's ethical, right? Because what good would it do for us to reproduce the harmful research that we were victims of? So for people who've been victims of unethical research, ethical research is vastly important. For a discipline that involves people who have been victims of unethical research, ethical research becomes vastly important. Okay. It says discuss the role of objectivity in research. How does Africana studies situate objectivity research from an Afrocentric perspective? So in normative research, right, in westernized research, this idea of objectivity they say is of foremost, right? You have to be objective. You cannot have these biases. You cannot have these preconceived notions about the people that you research, right? But again, coming from a community who has been the victim of unethical research, we know that's bullshit, right? Because this whole idea of pseudoscience is based on their objectivity, right? To say that someone is less intelligent because of the size of their head or the color of their skin, that's a far from objective statement. But for Africana studies and Afrocentricity, we say there's nothing wrong with being objective. In fact, you can't help but being subjective because you are who you are, right? So it's about using your subjectivity as a benefit, right? And I think when we covered this, I talked about Zora Neale Hurston and how she would go and interview and research the people from her community because she knew how to speak their language. She knew their customs. She knew their mores, right? So this is how, from an Afrocentric perspective, you having this subjectivity, your inability to be objective can be beneficial, right? Because if you're going to research a people who's the community that you're from, you're going to treat that community with a certain level of care, right? You're going to treat that community with a certain level of respect. You're going to do a good job of humanizing that community because you have a commitment to that community. You have a responsibility to that community, right? So from an Afrocentric perspective, having objectivity in research is not necessarily important. In fact, being able to realize and recognize your subjectivity can be a benefit. Okay. All right. The second bullet point on question 3: how does Ma'at help you think about ethical research? What are the 3 areas of Ma'at? What are the historical reasons for African people to be skeptical of research practices? So let's talk about the first portion, right? How does Ma'at help you think about ethical research? And we know that Ma'at is a goddess, right? We know that Ma'at was the moral code of ancient Kemet. We know that Ma'at embodies 7 principles: truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, reciprocity, propriety, right? So in ancient Kemet, if you were to do anything, it must be done in a way that is ma'atic, right? Also, we know that ma'at symbolizes the goddess who you must go before once you make your transition. She will be determining whether you make it to the afterlife or not. How you can state these 42 confessions of ma'at will determine if you can successfully navigate the afterlife, right? So if this is what ma'at is, how does ma'at help you think about ethical research?
That there is a right and wrong way to do things, as well as you'll have to pay for it.
Yes, right. So you want your research to be ma'atic, right? And you know, if you do research that is not in alignment with ma'at, at the day of your judgment, you're gonna have to come to terms with that, right? So absolutely, this is how this concept of ma'at helps us to think about ethical research. If everything that you must do must be ma'atic, your research is included, right? And then what are the 3 domains of Ma'at? And that's going to be found on page 94. I'm sorry, the 3 levels of Ma'at. There are 3 levels of Ma'at. The universal level, expressing the harmony and balance between all of the elements of the universe. 2, the political level, representing the establishment and advancement of justice and order in human society. Three, the individual level, representing the humans living and interacting with one another in accordance with code of Ma'at. So the three levels are the universal, the political, and the individual, right? So the universe must be in alignment with Ma'at. The politics must be in alignment with Ma'at. And then you as an individual must be in alignment with Ma'at. So those are the three levels of Ma'at. And then we kind of talked about this last one already. What are the historical reasons for African people being skeptical of research practices? Again, talking about, this is Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Talking about the brutalization and mutilization and brutality done on the African women's body for the sake of genealogical research, right? And reproductive research and things like that. So these are some of the historical factors that causes African people to be skeptical, to be fearful of standardized research practices. Thinking about the indigenous community, right? Smallpox being provided to them in blankets and things of that nature. So these are some of the terroristic European research practices that cause African and indigenous people to be skeptical of standardized research practices. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions about section 3 and the bullet points for section 3? All right. So we'll move into the last section. That is the God Bless the Child Who Got His Own reading, African American male theory. Section 4, first question. What were the stated aims of African American male theory, AAMT? And it says on this is page 2 of the reading. Page 2, first paragraph on that page 2, it says, thus, it is our aim in this current paper to A, summarize the development of African American male studies. That's one aim. B, discuss the problematics of critical race theory and other attempts at theorizing the lives of African American boys and men. And C, at minimum, by building on aspects of ecological systems theory, provide some basic tenets to help situate and construct a dialogue towards a theory of African American male development, positions, and practices. So again, the aims, summarize the development of African American male studies, discuss the problematics of critical race theory, and build on ecological theories to produce some tenets that will help construct a dialogue on researching Black men. So those are the three aims of African American male theory, or AAMT, right? Summarize in the development of African American male studies, discuss the problems of CRT, critical race theory, and using ecological system theory, provide basic tenets to help construct a dialogue towards understanding Black boys and men. What were the main contributors to early research on African men, and what were the authors' contributions? So on the same page 2, towards the bottom of the page, the authors argued there were several major contributors to early general studies of men. Yet perhaps of greater influence on this particular field was the political and social milieu, the early epochs of male studies. Pleck and Pleck have contended that there were three social movements that engendered the study of male sex roles and altered the definitions of manhood and masculinity: the women's movement, gay liberation movement, and the men's movement. So these are the three ones, right? We have, we have the women's movement, gay liberation movement, and the men's movement, right? However, Franklin added the moral majority movement as a fourth, right? So the four are the women's movement, gay liberation movement, men's movement. The moral majority movement is the fourth. And so I also ask you, what were the contributions from the authors, right? So the current authors add specifically, in the case of African American men, the Black Power and Civil Rights Movement as the fifth. We also add, as a more recent impact on African American male studies and issues of African-centered movement, so the African-centered movement is the sixth, and ongoing impact of hip hop as the seventh. So there's 7 movements, right? There's 7 movements you should be able to account for. The authors of the text give you Black Power and Civil Rights, African-centered movement. So we have Black Power and Civil Rights, African-centered movement, and then hip hop. Those are the three that the authors provide, right? One more time. From the authors, Black Power and Civil Rights Movement, African-centered movement, and then the impact of hip hop are the three given to you by the authors. The four that are given to you from the article itself, we have women's movement, gay liberation movement, men's movement, moral majority movement. So you have four from the article, four from the article, three from the authors of the article. You should be able to discuss all seven of those, okay? Um, and then finally, for African American male theory, what are the 6 tenets of African American male theory? And those begin on page 7, I think. No, sorry, page 6 of the article. On page 6 of the article, the first tenet is A, individuals and collective experiences, behaviors, outcomes, events, phenomenon, and trajectory of African boys and men lives are best analyzed using an illogical systems approach. So that's the first one. B, there is something unique about being male and of African descent. C, there is a continuity and continuation of African culture, consciousness, and biology that influences the experience of African American boys and men. 4, D, African American boys and men are resistant and resilient. 5, excuse me. Race and racism coupled with classism and sexism have a profound impact on every aspect of the lives of African American boys and men. And then finally, 6F, the focus and purpose of study and programs concerning African American boys and men is for the pursuit of social justice. So you should be able to speak to all 6 of those and then choose 2 of the 6 that stood out to you, right? So if you like, African American boys and men are resistant and resilient, and you like the continuation and continuity of African culture for African boys and men, then those are the 2 that you'll talk about and why those 2 stood out to you. But you must be able to state all 6 of the tenets and then choose 2 of the 6 that you like the most. So, any questions on African American male theory or section 4? So by and large, that's going to be your midterm, right? Again, if we're thinking of these study guide sections as questions, right? Question 1, 2, 3, and 4. You only choose 3 of the 4 questions. So, for example, you're not too comfortable with the ethics chapter, then don't answer that question. You'll answer 1, you'll answer 2, you'll answer 4. That's perfectly fine. But again, be sure to answer every component of that question. If you leave out a bullet point, so to speak, then you're going to miss a point of the question. You want to answer every aspect of the question. Also, do not give me one essay addressing 3 questions. Like it should be 3 separate essays. Question 1, your essay response. Question 2, your essay response, space. Question 3, your essay response. So you have 3 separate essay responses on one PDF. Go ahead.
Is there a limit or so far that you don't want us to go? Like don't write me a 3-page essay for question 1 or something like that.
No. Just all I would tell you is to be thorough and make sure you answer the question in its entirety, right? Like, and if you do that, you're not going to be able to write that in no 4 sentences. Like, it's just not. That
Because one of my doctors was like, if you write me more than 5 pages, I'm not gonna read the last 2. And I'm like, that what if I got more to say?
If you write it, I'll read it. If you write it, I'll
Okay.
read it. But I just my more importantly, answer the question completely. That's really what I'm looking for.
Okay.
Good question. Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
You said that it would be out tomorrow or today? Tomorrow? Okay.
It'll be available first thing tomorrow morning. So you can start
Okay.
latest tomorrow. And then it's due by the end of day Monday. So
Got it. So like 11:59 Monday.
midnight. Yep.
Okay.
If shit comes up, I understand. Just hit me as soon as possible. Like, don't wait till it's due to tell me, oh, Professor so and so and so and so, whatever, whoop whoop. Like, just let me know ahead of time, and we can discuss some accommodations for you. I understand that shit happens, but 9 times out of 10, shit don't happen like the minute before it's due. You know what I mean? Like, I've been doing this a long time. I kind of know how it goes down, right? Like, just give me the heads up. Let me ask you all a question, and I want to hear from everyone individually. Like, based off of what we did today, how do you feel as far as your preparation for your midterm?
Um, I'm very prepared. And with you going over the study guide like that, I think my hardest thing is picking the questions that I'm gonna elaborate on. So
Okay. Brianna, how about you?
Um, well, with you like, going over the study guide first, like I feel like we'll be like mainly prepared to like, to like do the essay for each one. And I feel like it's gonna be pretty not easy, but like pretty smooth.
That's my desire. Dominica, how about you? How you feel?
I feel a little bit more confident and prepared just because like after going through the study guide, like the practice questions or whatever, I guess, it kind of like made me understand how to answer the questions when you open it later.
Okay, cool. How about you, sis? How you feel? Feel prepared?
Yes, I feel like you definitely went over everything thoroughly, and you provided us with what you expect, from each question. So I definitely feel good about it.
I bet. And there's no tricks, right? Like what you see on the study guide is gonna be on the midterm. I'm not into like trying to psych y'all out, no shit like that. Like this is the purpose of this is to have you prepared. I want you to do well, right? And again, give yourself the time. If you need to pick up the book and read through it again, do that, right? Like 6 days, you have that time. So don't stress yourself out. Don't put extra pressure on yourself that's not necessary. Just give yourself the time. Again, I cannot overstate enough. One question per day. That's a great pace. You won't be stressed. If you need to, you go back and read it over, right, to make sure it's sounding and feels the way that you want. But just give yourself the favor of giving yourself the time. Because as you see from these practice questions, like these are very convoluted and dense questions. So you have to take the time to read it carefully so that way you're answering every component of the question to get yourself the full point, right? Um, Let me do this. Look at y'all.
I have the most random question while you looking for whatever you're looking for. Do you teach like after we pass this course, do you teach another course on that campus?
I
And
may.
would you suggest another professor?
Yeah, any professor in the Africana Studies department is really dope. Like, there's another professor named is Brittany Hampton. Like that's my homegirl. We got our masters together at Cal State LA. So she's definitely good folks. Um, to be real with you, all of them is solid, man. Talawa, Lewis, Dr. Sarton, anybody within the department, I would definitely recommend you taking. I know Brittany, or Professor Hampton, she's doing a Africana Women's Studies course. So I
Okay.
would definitely recommend that. I believe I may be doing a hip hop course in the spring, but I don't know
Oh,
if it's going to be available yet. I know that we wrote it up last summer, but if it's available, then I'll be able to teach it. I'm not sure what the modality will be, as far as it will be online, Zoom, or in person. We're kind of still working that out. Um,
okay.
but yeah, just anything within Africana studies, the professors are super dope. And because of our chair, she makes sure that we stick to the discipline. Like it is very much in line with how the discipline is being taught and thought about.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.